patreon.com/myth_podcast.
Robots Radio presents
Myth, the podcast where we explore the very soul of the human story. It's the end of the growing season. You and your family have packed up your cart full of your garlic, onions, some barley, and you're headed off to the big city. The kids are excited. A day away from the farm, and the older kids are old enough to remember what it was like last time you visited. It's been a good growing season and you have quite the harvest and you're ready to get to market. You follow the river. You see some of your neighbors on their way to the market. And as you approach Babylon, you see those gates. And you remember these gates because they're hard to miss. The blue brick, the giant winged statues on either side of the main gate. You hear the bustle of the city as a diversity of people are coming together to celebrate the festival of the fall. You see the rich with their slaves. You see other merchants and farmers with their wares on the sides of the street, selling what they've brought, what they've worked all summer to create. It's an exciting time. This is how you get by for the winter. The things that you will sell today will keep you going for another year. You're proud of your crop. You worked hard. Long days, long nights. But even more proud are you of your children and getting to bring them back to the center of your world, this city that you live on the outskirts of. You point out the statues as you cross by, looming over the gates. And one of your kids feels a little bit nervous, as if the thing could come alive at any moment. Along the walls are decorated images of things from the past. Soldiers, gods, heroes. And you remember the stories. When you get to the town center, you can't help but notice the gigantic garden. Exotic trees and fruits from faraway lands grow inside this feat of engineering. You can hear the water trickling down through the structure. You can see the green of the plants standing above the blue bricks. All the colors along the walls decorating one of the most magnificent things you will see in your lifetime. Next to it is the palace of the king. And if the walls were impressive, the stone architecture of the palace, even more so. How somebody could have that much wealth. Your simple shack where you live is nothing in comparison to this gigantic structure. It represents the power and the majesty of the ruling class. And across from that, the temple of Marduk stands with a gigantic statue of your God, the patron god of your city. And as people come by, they worship. You see the priests out and about. You see the offerings burning at the temple. On your way into town, you may even take a moment to stop. Praise your Lord for the bountiful crop, for keeping your city and your family safe this year. Your oldest looks up at you and says, "Tell me this story again. Tell me the story." And you say, "Well, you've heard it so many times." And they say, "I know. I just want to hear it again. Tell me the story." And you point to the priest who's standing in front of the temple, getting ready to explain to the people, to the visitors, to the people who have lived in this area, why their god is the best god. And the story goes like this. In the beginning, neither heaven nor earth had names. Apsu, the god of fresh waters, and Tiamat, the goddess of the salt oceans, and Mumu, the god of the mist that rises from both of them, were still mingled as one. There were no mountains, there were no pastures, and not even a reed marsh could be found to break the surface of the waters. It was then that Apsu and Tiamat parented two gods, and then two more, who outgrew the first pair. These further parented gods until Ea, who was the god of rivers, and was Tiamat and Apsu's great-grandson, was born. Ea was the cleverest of the gods, and with his magic, Ea became the most powerful of the gods, ruling even his forebears. Apsu and Tiamat's descendants became an unruly crowd. Eventually, Apsu, in his frustration and inability to sleep with the clamor, went to Tiamat, and he proposed to her that he slay their noisy offspring. Tiamat was furious at his suggestion to kill their clan, but after leaving her, Apsu resolved to proceed with his murderous plan. When the young gods heard of his plot against them, they were silent and fearful. But soon, Ea was hatching a scheme. He cast a spell on Apsu, pulled Apsu's crown from his head, and slew him. Ea then built his palace on Apsu's waters, and it was there that, with the goddess Damkina, he fathered Marduk, the four-eared, four-eyed giant who was god of the rains and storms. The other gods, however, went to Tiamat and complained of how Ea had slain her husband. Aroused, she collected an army of dragons and monsters, and at its head was placed the god Kingu, whom she gave magical powers as well. Even Ea was at a loss how to combat such a host, until he finally called on his son Marduk. Marduk gladly agreed to take on his father's battle, on the condition that he, Marduk, would rule the gods after achieving this victory. The other gods agreed, and at a banquet, they gave him his royal robes and scepter. Marduk armed himself with a bow and arrows, a club, and lightning, and he went in search of Tiamat's monstrous army. Rolling his thunder and storms in front of him, he attacked, and Kingu's battle plan soon disintegrated. Tiamat was left alone to fight Marduk, and she howled as they closed for battle. They struggled as Marduk caught her in his nets. When she opened her mouth to devour him, he filled it with the evil wind that served him. She could not close her mouth, and his gale blasted in it, and he shot an arrow down her throat. It split her heart, and she was slain. After subduing the rest of her host, he took his club and split Tiamat's water-laden body in half, like a clamshell. Half he put in the sky and made the heavens, and he posted guards there to make sure that Tiamat's salt waters could not escape. Across the heavens he made stations in the stars for the gods, and he made the moon and set it forth on its schedule across the heavens. From the other half of Tiamat's body he made the land, which he placed over Apsu's fresh waters, which now arise in wells and springs. From her eyes he made flow the Tigris and Euphrates. Across this land he made the grains and herbs, the pastures and fields, the rain and the seeds, the cows and the ewes, and the forests and the orchards. Marduk set the vanquished gods who had supported Tiamat to a variety of tasks, including work in the fields and canals. Soon they complained of their work, however, and they rebelled by burning their spades and baskets. Marduk saw a solution to their labors, though, and proposed it to Ea. He had Kingu, Tiamat's general, brought forward from the ranks of the defeated gods, and Kingu was slain. With Kingu's blood, with clay from the earth, and with spittle from the other gods, Ea and the birth goddess Nintu created humans. On them, Ea imposed the labor previously assigned to the gods. Thus the humans were set to maintain the canals and boundary ditches, to hoe and to carry, to irrigate the land and to raise crops, to raise animals and fill the granaries, and to worship the gods at their regular festivals. This story might well be the oldest story that we have access to. It was written on tablets that were discovered only about 130, 150 years ago. And we've found versions of this stories written at later dates as well. The date that we can most likely attribute the Enuma Elish to is from about 2,000 years BC, 4,000 years ago. Think of that. This story is at least as distant from the time of Christ as we are. By the time of Jesus walked the earth, this story was already ancient. And it's like any other creation myth from the ancient world. Most likely it was carried forward generation to generation through oral storytelling. Priests at the temple, parents to their children, at night when they were at the fire cooking dinner and needed something to talk about. And I'm sure children would ask questions. Why is Marduk the most powerful of the gods? What was the world like before there was a world? Where did the chaos come from? What were the waters? Was there something before that? You have to remember that human beings, for thousands and thousands of years, are biologically the same. There are small variations. We have cultural changes through time. Things like hair color, skin color. But the fundamental DNA of humans from 4,000 years ago and older, and humans today, is compatible. If we were to run into people from that time, they might be shorter than us. They might look a little different. But mentally, they were still human. They had the same questions, the same hopes, the same dreams. There's something fundamental about humanity that these myths, that these stories point to. And I noted this in the introductory episode. Oftentimes creation stories and myths in general say more about the person telling the story, the culture the story came from, than the actual nature of the world. In this story, we have Marduk, the god of Babylon, their patron god, the one they raise up on high and tell stories about. And why did they do that? We need to look at these stories from the perspective of humans out, rather than from the creation back to us. Why do they worship Marduk? Because sometime in the history of this storytelling, the city needed an identity. The people needed something to cling to. They needed a story to make them feel like they had purpose, to give them a place in the world, to make them feel different and more validated in existing, in being, in the things that they have than their neighbors. And if a neighbor was to have picked a different god and they were at war with that neighbor, let's say they picked Kingu, then it would only make sense to craft stories about Marduk and Marduk's destruction of Kingu. What that shows is that this community is the best. We are the best people. Of all the peoples of the earth, we are the best. Our God is the best. We have claim to the best. We get the most blessings. We have the best harvests. We have the most powerful society. We have the best city. All of those things. And you have to remember that the world of these people thousands and thousands of years ago was not that big. A farmer would have traveled between their farmland and their major city or two in their lifetime. Most never made it outside of their local area. Traders would travel between cities, but the majority of the population stayed put. The world was very small and yet very large. The idea that there was more out there beyond the confines of their city and that it could be anything was fact. It was understood. When these myths talk about gods and numbers of other gods and a history that seems so long ago, yet still almost in the present, still almost affecting their daily lives. And when the stories talk about monsters and creatures from the world around that the gods created, those were very real to these people. When things went bump in the night, they didn't know what they were. When they came across a creature they'd never seen before, it was another fascinating monster of the world. When their king came back from conquest in a foreign land and brought the first elephant or tiger, the people thought, wow, this is amazing. There must be thousands and thousands of other strange and wonderful creatures and monsters out in the world. And to this community, to these people, magic was real. Magic wasn't magic because it was different than the world they lived in, because it was other. Magic was magic because it was fundamental to the world they lived in. Why did the crops grow? Magic. The crops gained power from the earth and from the rains. It was that simple. Who supplied the rains? Who supplied the earth? Well, clearly it came from their God, because their God blessed them with those things. It was a very simple explanation, but it was very specifically used to place them at the height of society, at the height of creation, to give them purpose. And this is the foundation for many, many myths. Now, one of the things that I'm going to be going into in future episodes of this show are other creation myths and other stories. And this creation myth is one of a class of creation myths. All creation myths can be divided up into different categories. This one is from chaos. The waters at the beginning are a chaotic mixture of potential. And that's where the gods come from. And the gods themselves, the waters themselves, Apsu, Tiamat, at the beginning, they're almost more forces of nature than they are personalities. And we're going to delve into some other chaos creation stories and a variety of other ones, which may seem even more foreign to your intellectual palate, let's say, to your experience. Now, this creation story, being that it's Middle Eastern, and most of us in Western society have some understanding of the biblical creation story, you can see parallels. You can also see parallels with some other myths that we may be a little bit more familiar with. For example, the ancient Greeks. Marduk is the most powerful of the gods, the god of the sky and of lightning. It's no coincidence, then, that the king of the gods to the ancient Greeks is Zeus, the god of the sky and lightning. And in fact, Yahweh in the Old Testament is often associated with the sky. These are common themes that show up in these cultures as people mixed and as cultures moved through time. The other thing we need to realize about this, and this is going to be a common theme that's going to come up in a lot of these shows, is that the amount of time that goes by, even though most people never left their local areas, the amount of time that goes by over thousands and thousands of years is very, very long. Think about it in modern terms. When we think back a generation or two, the world is very different. Modern society changes so quickly. If we go back 400 years, culture is extremely different. 1,000 years, and we are in the Dark Ages in Western society. The world isn't that different from fundamentally the way the world worked in ancient times. Now imagine cultures and people, years upon years, generations upon generations, telling the same stories, sharing the same ideas, trading with the same other neighboring cultures. Eventually those ideas mix, like a virus spreading around the globe very slowly. And that doesn't mean that all cultures have similarities, but it does mean that ones that are closer together in proximity are more likely to have similarities. Themes, ideas, concepts leak in and evolve over time. The version of this story that is dug up in 300 BC is not the same version of the story that was put into the tablets that came from a time around 2000 BC. That's 1700 years. Things change in time. Thank you for listening to Myth. I am your host, Tom, and I'm happy that you're here. This is a new endeavor for me. I have a few other podcasts that I do on the Robots Radio Network, and most of them are featured on the lore of video game worlds like Fallout and Elder Scrolls. I've got the Fallout Lorecast and the Elder Scrolls Lorecast, and I also have some other shows about some of my thoughts. Robots Thoughts is what that's called. I often go by Robots Online. And Sleepy Time Stories, which I tell stories from video games in a very slow, dulcet tone to help people get to sleep. And those two are kind of my side projects. But my main shows are the Fallout Lorecast and the Elder Scrolls Lorecast. So if you're into those worlds at all, please go check those out. But I thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I wanted to dig into the human history, the soul of our culture and of our peoples. And there's so many good stories to get into that I hope you hang out with me in the future for more interesting stories. If you are interested in helping me to grow this show, then the absolute best thing you could possibly do is to tell your friends. If you have friends who are interested in this kind of content, please let them know. Say, hey, there's this new podcast. It's called Myth. You can get it anywhere. It's on iTunes. It's on Spotify. It's anywhere else. I think you'll love it. And Tom, the host, is an amazing host, and he's super handsome and really, really smart. You don't have to include the last part. But just tell them about the show. Tell them the show is lots of fun and really cool and that they will enjoy it. Also, please, please, please leave a rating or review on iTunes. And in future episodes of the show, I will be calling out and reading any of the reviews that I get on iTunes at the end of the show. So if you do leave a review, then listen through the end and I'm going to read it out on a future episode. Also, this show is brought to you very much by advertising, but if you don't want to be advertised to, then you are going to be able to get this show advertise free by being a patron at patreon.com/mythpodcast. And every patron gets this show ad free from the Patreon RSS feed. Any amount of contribution you can make to the show will go towards me growing the show, being able to do more interesting content, spending more time digging into the history of these myths, and just creating more and better content, as well as running the network in general. This has been a long-term goal of mine for a while. So if you're interested in checking out what else is on the network, go check out robotsradio.net. You'll find lots of really high quality content like Chad, a Fallout 76 story, or Written in Uncertainty, which explores the deep lore of a series like the Elder Scrolls games. And if you're interested in getting a hold of me, you can send an email to myththepodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter at podcastmyth. So Myth Podcast was taken. I couldn't use that one. So at podcastmyth on Twitter. And also on Twitter, I will be releasing information about some of the topics that I go over and some images and those kinds of things on the Twitter feed. So if you're interested in staying plugged in that way as well and getting kind of a glimpse of some upcoming episode content, then go check that out. That's a great place to be connected. Also, one other place that you can be involved with the community of Robots Radio is on our Discord channel, and all of these things have links in the show notes. So if you want to get into chats about some of the content that we go over in the show, or you have some questions, or you just want to get a hold of me, that's a great place to go log in. And there's an app, and it's actually very easy to access. So if you want to do that, that's also available to you. And if you're interested in looking more into the sources that I use on the show or any of the music, you can find that in the show notes as well. Everything will be sourced that I pull directly from. So, for example, the Enuma Elish story itself is a very specific story used from the gly.uga.edu website. So thank you again for tuning in. I genuinely appreciate it. And hopefully next time we'll have some reviews to go over at the end of the episode. You guys have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you later. Bye. Thanks for listening to Myth. If you'd like to send us a note, we'd love to hear from you at myththepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter @podcastmyth. If you'd like to support the show, please tell a friend or leave a review on iTunes. Or if you'd like to help us out financially and experience an ad-free version of the show, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/myth_podcast. Thanks for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons at patreon.com/myth_podcast.
Robots Radio presents
Myth, the podcast where we explore the very soul of the human story. After a long day of travel, you take your camels and you hitch them to the posts at this little village on the outskirts of an area that you know you're going to have to get through in order to get to the next major city. Being a trader is difficult. Sometimes you have to travel long distances and over terrain that doesn't have roads, has no signs along the way. You and your companion have a number of camel and just enough supplies to get you to the next stop. But you're looking for directions. You know that this path is going to be treacherous. There isn't going to be a place where you can stop and get a drink, so you need to bring all the water with you. It's going to take a few days to get to the next town. And so traditionally, you've hired a guide at this village the last 2 times you've been through here, and that has worked out well. It's worth the cost. It gets you where you need to go, and you still haven't done this part of the trip enough times yet to really know the landmarks. So you find a local guide, and when you come across the guide, he and his friends are talking. You don't understand all of the words. You are far enough away from home now where you know bits and pieces of the language. But what you can make out is a story about some sort of creature or monster or lizard, something in the desert. The desert worm, maybe? You're not sure exactly what this is. It is a little unsettling, but you've got your work to do. You need to get to the next town. So you hire your guide and you head out. This area of the desert is known for sandstorms and for unexpected weather conditions. It's also extremely dry. There is not a drop of water to be found until you get to your destination. So your camels are even more valuable. They are heavily laden with extra packs of water, along with all of the items you hope to sell in the next town. These camels and the supplies they're carrying are worth their weight in your life. You could say gold, but gold would be a little extravagant. If something were to happen to these pack animals and you could not carry the water that you need, or you could not get these items where they need to go in order to sell them, in order to pay for your trip and make the money that you need to live off of, that would be your life right there. So you are taking very good care of these creatures as you trudge into the desert. As night comes, you start to hear the winds pick up. What starts as a nice evening breeze, wicking away some of the heat of the day, slowly begins to pick up. You look over at your guide, and your guide is very aware of the situation, scanning the horizon in the dying light of the sun. And in the distance, they make out what appears to be a haze. There's a strange color in the sunset, and your guide looks at you with earnest eyes and says, "We need shelter." So you double your pace. You make the camels move as fast as they possibly can. You and your companion and your guide head towards some hills you saw off in the distance, hoping that you can find some sort of shelter. It is barren out here. There is not much in the way of trees or overgrowth. There's definitely not any human man-made structures. So your one hope is, can we get to a cave? Can we find an outcropping? And it looks like the gods are with you today, because as the wind is beginning to pick up more and more and it's becoming harder to see, you stumble across the opening in the side of a hill where you can just fit yourselves and your camels into the crevice. You hunker down, you cover yourself with blankets, you cover up the camels' eyes, make sure that they are safe, and you get low in order to weather out this windstorm for the night. After a very long night with very little sleep, the morning sun breaks as the wind starts to settle, and you start cleaning the dirt and the sand off of your clothes and off of your camels. And as you leave this crevice, this small indentation of earth that saved your lives, your guide decides to step away in order to scan the horizon to determine where they are and what direction you need to be going next. And when your guide turns back around, their eyes get large, and you look at them and say, "Hey, what is it? What do you see?" And the guide points to the side of the cliff, the side of the hill that you were hiding in. And they say, "Dragon." You and your companion step out, and you can see what the winds have revealed over the night. In the very rock of the edge of this little crevice, this little bump in the side of a hill, extending back from the area that you survived the night in, is what appears to be the skeleton of a gigantic beast. A head and a very long neck and spines, and what may very well be legs or feet and bones and odd structures. It's a dragon, all right, but it's not alive. Dragons in mythology can be found in cultures across the world. They are ubiquitous, we could say. Now, they're not necessarily in every single culture across the world. There are lots of individual cultures across the world, but you can find stories of dragon-like creatures in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, in communities that are very removed from each other. And one of the theories as to why this is has to do with the misinterpreting of fossils. Because we did have dragons on this world at one point, and it was millions of years ago. And the dragons that walked the earth may not have had 4 legs and wings like a classical European dragon, but they were serpentine. Many of them looked like reptiles. And ancient people who came across the remains of these creatures, the fossils which had turned into rock over millions of years, would not have necessarily known that they were looking at something that had lived so long ago. Imagine that you are from a culture where you have no understanding of the true history of the earth. You don't know how animals evolved, how they changed over time, the fossil record, DNA, none of that stuff you're particularly aware of. But what you do know is when you come across the skull of a very large creature, the size of a man, the skull itself the size of a human, with gigantic teeth, and it is formed into the side of a rock, that appears like magic. That appears to be something unique, and it deserves a story. And you know you're going to talk about this. When you and your companions make it to the next town, you're going to confirm that this desert does in fact have worms or dragons or whatever word the commoners use to explain a gigantic lizard. And you found proof because you saw the bones. You didn't come across a living one, but you saw the bones. And you might even associate those bones with the weather, with the storm that you just survived. Maybe there was a conflict in the night between giant worms, and this is the one that died. You don't know. All you know is that you saw with your own eyes a gigantic lizard or snake-like creature in the side of a cliff. And that story spreads. That is not a story that people are going to keep to themselves. And not only will the people you will talk to share this story, but you, as traveling traders, will communicate this to everyone you come across. This is the news of the day. This is the most exciting thing that has happened to you in a very long time. You're going to tell everyone you come across about the dragon in the desert and about that terrible night. And that story will get bigger and more interesting the more you tell it. In doing research for this episode, I came across a wonderful article at mythology.wikia.org. And thank you to whoever is contributing to these wikis, because there's lots of great information in them and sources and those kinds of things. And this episode, I will be pulling directly from that wiki article. They do a wonderful job detailing the different types of dragons across different cultures. And so we're going to dive into this right here with the etymology of the word dragon. And according to this article, it derives from the Greek word drakon, meaning a serpent of huge size, a python, a dragon. And that from the verb derkomai, which means to see clearly. The related term dragoon for infantry that move around by horse yet still fight as foot soldiers is derived from their early firearm, the dragon, a wide-bore musket that spat flame when it fired, and was thus named for the mythical creature. The uncommon name Dagon, Daegon, usually used in ancient writings, also means dragon. Now, the dragons that we are most generally familiar with in Western society are of European origin. A typical example would be dragons from Catalonia, Catalan dragons. They're depicted as serpent-like creatures with 2 or 4 legs. And this is something that gets debated a lot. Why not a wyvern? Wyvern? Whatever the best way to pronounce that is, I'm not sure. People will often get in arguments on the internet about dragons have 4 legs and wings. Wyverns have 2 legs and wings. So in movies like The Lord of the Rings, like in The Hobbit or in the Game of Thrones movies, that those are actually wyverns. They're not dragons. And they may not be dragons in the typical European shape, but overall, we can use the word dragon to mean anything with a serpent-like neck, a reptilian head, wings, and some sort of body, and maybe not even wings. In some cases, they're just worms. But let's get into this a little bit. It says here that female Catalan dragons are named vibria. Their breath is poisonous, said to be capable to rot anything or anyone it touches. In French legend, dragons are referred to as dragoons. In Italian legend, more exactly in Sardinian myth, a dragon named Scoltone is mentioned. This dragon had the power to kill humans with his gaze. It's said that it was immortal, resided in rural, underdeveloped land and country areas. So what about dragons from Asia? Chinese dragons are more snake-like than European ones and are generally depicted and portrayed as benevolent beings, though there are exceptions in both cases. Such dragons are also depicted in varying shapes, colors, and sizes, with some similar to the fairies of other cultures. Japanese dragons are very similar to Chinese dragons, but have 3 claws instead of 4. Usually are depicted as being benevolent and golden in color. These types of dragons are usually perceived as signs of good luck in Chinese culture. Then we have Norse mythology, which has become a little bit more popular lately with movies like The Avengers and heroes like Thor, who comes from Norse mythology, and also games, video games like God of War, which originally was based in Greek mythology, but now, because of the most recent one, has dug into Norse mythology. So in Norse mythology, lindworms were serpent-like dragons with either 2 or no legs. The world serpent, and I'm going to take a stab at this name. I think it's pronounced Jormungandr, but I could be wrong, is depicted as a giant snake with attributes of a dragon. The poem Voluspa states the being Neohogr is a dragon. And again, I'm probably mangling these words, so I apologize if this is closer to your own language than mine. Another being described as a dragon is Fafnir from the Poetic Edda, which was a lindworm. Dragon heads adorned Viking longboats in order to strike fear into the hearts of enemies on raids. Then we can go back to Greek mythology. In Homer's Iliad, Agamemnon is described as having a blue-colored dragon motif on his sword belt and a 3-headed dragon emblem on his breastplate. Ares has 2 dragon sons who guard his sacred forests. In Egyptian mythology, Apep, also known as Apophis, was a divine serpent or giant snake. Apophis is supposedly the mortal enemy of Ra, the sun god. Then there's Hindu mythology, in which draconic serpents known as Nagas are prominent and are usually equated with cobras. They are usually neutral beings, but are often portrayed as benevolent rather than malevolent. Now, this isn't a total and comprehensive list by any means. There are dragons and cultures in Indonesia and other places in Asia, but then even in the Americas. In North America, the Payasa bird of the Illini people was sort of dragon-like in its appearance. Then you have Mayan mythology with Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl of Aztec mythology. All of these things could be equated in similar ways to dragons and dragon mythology across many cultures. Even in South America, you have Amaru, a dragon or chimera of Incan mythology. These ancient cultures all have something in common in that they must have been drawing at least the idea of the physical shape of these creatures from something. Last week, we even talked about Babylon, and there are even dragons that show up in Mesopotamian myth. In Sumerian poetry, great kings are often compared to Usumgal, a gigantic serpentine monster. A dragon-like creature with the foreparts of a lion and the hind legs, tail, and wings of a bird appears in Mesopotamian artwork and the Akkadian period. Until the Neo-Babylonian period, the dragon is usually shown with its mouth open. It may have been known as the Umu, or Naru, which means roaring weather beast. The weather connection, right? And may have been associated with the god Ishkur. A slightly different lion dragon with two horns and a tail of a scorpion appears in art from the Neo-Assyrian period, which is 900 to about 600 BC. A relief probably commissioned by Sennacherib shows the gods Ashur, Sin, and Adad standing on its back. And even in the story that we read last week, Tiamat is oftentimes portrayed as a dragon-like creature. So there are connections across all of this. Now, you will notice that sometimes the dragon imagery gets mixed with other animals. You end up with more of a chimera, something with like a lion head or a snake tail or horns or other features from other animals. That's not uncommon to have the mixing of different similar animal archetypes in mythology, and that's fairly common. But the idea that there is this fundamental similarity across dragon-like creatures, giant monster-like creatures of great power, mystery, is something that is almost universal. Thanks for tuning into our second full episode of Myth. I am your host, Tom, and I welcome you here. I'm glad you guys are coming back for another episode. I hope you're enjoying the show. On some future episodes, we'll dig a little bit deeper into specific mythologies that mention specific dragons, but I wanted to go over dragons in an early episode because it's such an interesting topic, and it's something that, as I mentioned before, resonates across many different cultures. And that's something that I want to get to in this show. That's one of the themes that's going to pop up is similarities between cultures. We'll talk about some of the differences too. But again, there's something fundamental to being human that brings us together and creates very similar ideas across very large distances. And I think that that's fascinating. So thank you for going on this journey with me, and I appreciate you guys being here. I hope you're enjoying the show. If you are interested in helping to support the show, then the best thing you can possibly do is tell a friend about it. If you're having a lot of fun listening, then please share it with a friend. And if you are an iTunes user and would like to do me a huge favor, if you leave a rating and a review on iTunes at the end of the episode, I will be reading out the review. And man, we've got a bunch today, so stay tuned for those. Those are always fun to go over. And thank you to everybody who took the time to listen to the shows, to give me your feedback, and to leave 5-star reviews on iTunes. That is such a big help in getting a new show launched. So I really do appreciate it. In other news, This is part of the Robots Radio network of podcasts, and this is the first mythology kind of history podcast we have on the network. If you're interested in things like video games and some of the interesting stuff going on behind video games and stories and things like that, then go to robotsradio.net and check out some of the other shows. We have shows about the stories in video games, things like Hidden Pixels. We have shows about the lore behind Fallout and the Elder Scrolls games. That's Fallout Lorecast and Elder Scrolls Lorecast, hosted by myself. We also have deeper dives into the lore, like Written in Uncertainty for Elder Scrolls. And then we have some new shows that are coming onto the network, and even some other shows that are storytelling, like the Chad Fallout 76 story. So go check that out, robotsradio.net. There might be something that you find interesting on there. So the other thing to mention is that if you are looking to help support this show in any way financially, which would be extremely helpful because that will help me keep doing these shows, help paying for things. That's unfortunately a part of just doing anything, is you need to be able to make a little bit of money in order to make sure you can keep doing it. But if you're interested in any of that, go to patreon.com/myth_podcast and check out the different tiers. There's a bunch of stuff you can get, and every patron, even at the tier 1 level, will get this show advertising free, no ads. So that's just the simplest thing I can do to thank you for helping support it financially. If you're paying for this, you don't need to listen to ads. So go check that out if you're interested. And now on to our iTunes reviews. So first of all, you guys are amazing. This is amazing. There was an intro episode that came out. Then there was the first episode of the show, the first full-length episode. And in less than a week, we already have 11. I'm going to mess up the words. I'm so excited. 11 5-star ratings, 9 of which left reviews. And I'm going to have to go through here and read each of these in order to tell each of you thank you for taking the time to do this. This is amazing. Thank you so much. This is such a big deal. If you launch a show on iTunes and in the first 8 weeks it gets enough downloads and enough reviews and ratings, then you can get into the new and noteworthy section, which means that more people can see the show when they search for shows. And that is huge in getting a show started. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. I don't have words. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to try and get through these quickly, but I want to give them their own due time. So first of all, we have Ghostius412, 5-star reviews, great podcast. Robots is a great guy, and I love all of his well-made podcasts. Thank you, Ghostius. I really do appreciate that. Then we have ABP Finance, who writes, great pod, 5 stars. This guy is awesome. Well, thanks. Great show and fantastic insights. All of a sudden my voice got all fancy. Fantastic insights. So thank you so much. Man, you guys are so complimentary towards me. That's very nice of you. I really do appreciate that. Then we have Seb1133444727226, who writes, great show, 5 stars. Not only am I learning about human history through this show, I'm also getting great and entertaining storytelling too. Robots. And these guys must be fans of my other shows because, and I think I mentioned this on one of the previous shows, online and in games and things, I often go by the name Robots. So thank you for being fans of multiple of my shows. I really do appreciate it. Robots already has some worthwhile shows. So you know his take on myths is going to be fantastic. Well, thank you, Seb. I really do appreciate that. Then we have Ken4656, who writes, Tom does it again, 5 stars. I'm a nut for history and mythology, and this show tackles both in a clear and understandable way. Well done. Awesome. I'm glad I can do both of those things for you guys. And this show will continue to evolve as we dig into the material. And the more that I get feedback from you guys about what resonates with you and how you prefer for this show to be displayed isn't the right word, presented to you, I guess is what that means. Then we have Urban Myth 61, who writes, wow, I'm impressed, 5 stars. Great voice, insightful information, high quality production, engaging presentation. I'm very capital word, very impressed with the first full episode. Keep it up, Tom. Can't wait for episode 2. Well, guess what? You get episode 2 right now. Thank you so much, Urban Myth, for writing that in. Then we have Ashium, who I'm going to admit is a friend of mine. This one I actually know. And this is a good friend of mine I've known since high school named Chris, who is actually a pastor at a Methodist church. Man, I hope I'm not giving too much away, Chris. People are going to look you up online now. I'm sorry, man. So Ashiam writes, I've only heard the first episode and I love the concept of myth and the story that reveals deeper truths about what in our identity is culture and what is human. Very cool. Myth is good. 5 stars. Thank you. Thank you, buddy. I appreciate that review. Then we have Brandroid, who writes, and another one, 5 stars. Another fan of some of the other shows. One more great production from Robots Radio. Not only should you listen to this show, but the network's other great programs. Well, thank you, Brandroid. I really do appreciate that. Man, some of you guys are just so nice to me, and I really do appreciate it. Then we have Lord Marksman, Mythology, 5 stars. I absolutely love mythology and can't wait for this show to start diving into the gods, Greek, Roman, Norse, and more. Keep it up. Oh, we will get to the gods. We've actually started with the first episode about some of the gods and took a little bit of a side detour to talk dragons. There be dragons. But yeah, we're going to get to all sorts of really cool stories about the gods. Don't you worry, my friend. Then we have Sparky72235, who writes, great start, ! 5 stars. It's not often that a new podcast shows up and sounds so polished. Where did this guy come from? I live in Florida. If this is just the beginning, I can't wait to see where this goes. Me too. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you for that review, Sparky. And man, thank you for all the kind words. And I really do appreciate any feedback that you give me. If you have any critiques or concerns or anything like that, shoot me an email at myththepodcast@gmail.com or shoot me a private message on Twitter at podcast myth. I had to do that one backwards because myth podcast was taken. And man, I wish I had myth podcast. That'd be great on Twitter. If anybody knows how to get that account, let me know. And then if you want to join us on the Discord, where there's currently a lot of conversation about the other shows, video games and stuff. But if you guys start showing up on the Discord because you're fans of myth, I will definitely, well, you know what? I'm just going to do it today. I'm going to set up a channel where we can discuss mythology and all sorts of stuff that comes up on this show. So if you're interested in joining that conversation as well, you'll find a lot of really cool people in the Discord. There's already a few hundred people who jump in there every day and chat about things. So there's show notes. There's a link in the show notes. You can check that out. Also in the show notes at the very bottom, I believe there's a link for leaving a voice message to me. So if you'd rather reach out to me with your voice, you can just click that, especially if you're on mobile, and just kind of open up a link and send me a voice message on your phone. And if you would like to get your message on the show at the end of the show, go to robotsradio.net and check out the Jumbotron feature where you can pay to put your own message on the show. So for example, if you want to send something to your best friend, or if you'd like to advertise anything on the show, you can use it there. The prices are very cheap, especially when it comes to advertising, especially because this is a new feature. So go check that out. Let me know what you think. And thank you again, everybody, for tuning into this episode. I can't wait to get into even more really cool myth stuff in the future. And until next week, be careful where you travel because there be dragons. Man, that was super cheesy. All right, I'll see you guys later. Bye. Thanks for listening to Myth. If you'd like to send us a note, we'd love to hear from you at myththepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter @podcastmyth. If you'd like to support the show, please tell a friend or leave a review on iTunes. Or if you'd like to help us out financially and experience an ad-free version of the show, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/myth_podcast. Thanks for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons at patreon.com/myth_podcast.
Robots Radio presents
Myth, the podcast where we explore the very soul of the human story. They called it the long night. The day when day didn't come. You remember it. You woke up early, like you normally do, before the sun rises, to set off on your trek, to hunt. You know, if you get out there before the animals are awake, that you have an advantage. You and your group headed off towards the east, expecting the sunrise, but it never came. Usually when you woke, you can see the beginnings of dawn on the edges of the horizon. But this morning was different. It was darker. And as the little bit of light arrived in the sky, it appeared like a deep, dark haze was covering the horizon. You turned back around to the village. This was a bad omen. The gods were angry, maybe? Someone had committed a crime against the god of the morning? The ancestors were stirring and upset. Something was wrong. So your hunting party headed back to the rest of your companions, to your humble nomadic village, if village was even the right word for it. You found the elder, the wise woman who led your group, and she was already aware of the situation when you returned. In the sand, she was making markings and burning incense and praying. Before too long, she gathered the entire community together, all of about 30 of you, families, friends, and she said, "This is indeed a bad omen. For today might not dawn. There is no day on the horizon. We must go about our regular routines. Do not let this sway you from your regular paths. But be wary, for this will be a long night." And she was right. You think back to this day, or long night, a lot, because this night extended for more than a week. There was light, but it wasn't like a regular day. It was dark and reddened. It seemed to come from the southeast and spread over the horizon on that first day and lingered in the air for a long time. For most of that year, the sky did not look right, and within the next few days after the first long night, the rain was black. The plants in the fields began to shrivel, and the animals' schedules were changed. Your regular hunting patterns no longer worked, and many animals were scrounging for whatever food they could find. Your village lost half of its population in the first month. But things changed. Your wise woman wasn't like the others you had met among other tribes. She was different. She prayed, like all the wise women did, on the events that occurred on that first long night, and she prayed the second night as well, and the third. And after 3 days of returning with very little food and a community of people who were looking for answers, she came up with a new idea. Instead of traveling day after day and seeking the wildlife free in the wilds and the nuts and fruits and berries on the trees that you pass in your travels, she suggested that you make a home, a place to stay. That travel was no longer beneficial to the tribe. And there was great debate among the members of the tribe. Stay in one place? How will we find food? Stay in one place? Is that even safe? And she responded that she had prayed for 3 days and sent offerings to the god of the dawn and the light. But there was no response. It was time to find new gods. So she said, "We will now be worshiping the gods of the dark, the gods of the ground, the earth, the gods of the sea, and we will be sending our offerings to the sea and to the ground. For in the sea and the ground will come our food." We didn't understand what she meant at the time. Who are these other gods? We've always worshipped the god of the dawn, the god of light. That has been the god of our people. There was much debate about this. And then she showed us what she was talking about. She took the seeds, and instead of burning them, she offered them to the god of the water. And the god of the water responded. The fish in the water were hungry, and they came to the surface, and our people ate. Then she took us to the god of the dark. A nearby cave provided fungus, mushrooms, and other things to eat. And so we ate. And the god of the ground. She took us to the plants that were still living with the minimal amount of light left. And she took their seeds, and this time she placed them in the earth. And before too long, those seeds began to grow. And it's in this way that your tribe survived. The dayless week turned into the dayless month, and slowly the light continued to grow in the sky, but it did not return to normal very soon. Your typical camp turned into dwellings, a village. People took the structures that they built and tore down week after week as you traveled and made them more permanent. You began to learn which fish were still living in the sea and could be trapped easily. You also learned how to contain those fish in your own ponds and to breed them, how to grow mushrooms in the dark, and how to plant and water your own crops. Your group, though, longed to travel to find the animals that were still out in the wild. So after a few weeks of harvesting the rewards from these new gods, you set out with another party, and this time you took with you the ideas that the old woman seeded in your mind, the same way she seeded these new gods. And you found some wild boar among the brush, eating anything they could find to stay alive. But this time, instead of killing them with your spears, instead of hunting them and killing them and returning with their carcasses to cook and use once, you captured them. You set traps. You gathered the boars instead of harvesting the boars. And you celebrated that night when you returned with 6 boars, 3 male and 3 female. You constructed a pen, and those boars have been living with your group now for a few weeks. One of them is pregnant. And so a new god has joined your pantheon. You are no longer praying to the god of the hunt, but to the god of life, of the animals. And this group of animals will continue to grow, much like the crops that you're sowing, and the fish, and your own people. The death across your community has ceased. You again have food, regular food, daily, to support the community. And the community isn't only growing from inside. As other nomadic bands travel past, they become curious of your village. They have never seen anything like it. Crops growing in the village, people who aren't starving and traveling to find all the food that they need. And carefully, you begin expanding your village with more travelers who come by. Eventually, this village grows, and you become a community of many tribes working together and sharing the knowledge of these new gods who have provided in a time when the god of the dawn has forsaken. And this is the way that you survive. And this changes humanity forever. So I like to direct these stories in second person around you and put you in that situation. And you in this story wouldn't know, looking up into that night sky before the clouds covered it, that those stars were in different places than they are now. That 70,000 years from these stories about your people, another group of people would be looking into that night sky and seeing the stars in slightly different locations. That's how much time had passed. And that in the 70,000 years since these events, that humanity had over 7.5 billion people. That number to you 70,000 years ago would have seemed completely impossible. The events that I'm talking about don't specifically show up as stories in any mythology, but they may have affected the gods and the myths and the stories of our ancestors. Because 70,000 years ago, humanity was almost wiped off the face of this planet by an eruption, an enormous volcanic eruption that we now know happened in Sumatra in Lake Toba. There were most likely not very many people living in the islands of southern Asia at that time, but this eruption, we know, covered the planet in darkness. It affected the life on the planet, the plants and the animals, and many plants and animals survived, along with humans, because this wasn't a mass extinction in the way that ended the dinosaurs, but it was an extinction event because some creatures did not survive this. And humanity was almost on that list. It is speculated by scientists that as few as 2,000 human beings survived this event. 2,000. Picture that. When I think back to high school, I went to a high school that had over 2,000 students in one high school. That is how small the human population became. And there's speculation about this. There's not a lot we know because this was before the times of writings. There aren't stories that come directly from this time. But the story that I'm putting you into in this episode is a circumstance that may well have happened because we do know a few things. We know that humans before 70,000 years ago were not farming. They were gathering and they were hunting and they were nomadic. We also know that humans after 70,000 years ago are the only humans who developed those skills. And here's the thought. Events like this are called bottlenecks. They take a population and they reduce the population to a very, very small group. That very small group survived because of something. Something happened differently with this group of humans that did not happen with the vast majority of humans who did not survive this event. So what was it? Was it circumstantial? Did they happen to be in a specific location on the planet that wasn't as affected as everyone else? Chances are that's not the case because the planet as a whole was affected. Well, then what was it? What gave 2,000 people the ability to survive this event that the other 99% of the population didn't have? And here's the theory. That group of 2,000 people were smart enough to change what they were doing. They were able to think critically, and they didn't just go with tradition. They didn't just keep doing the things that they typically would have done that always had worked. The sun god always rose in the sky every day. The plants grew. The animals were plentiful. The earth provided. But when this event happened, the earth no longer provided. The sun god did not rise. Things began to die, and people began to starve. So the idea here is that at some point, somebody or some groups of people changed what they were doing. They found a way to survive. And the only way that they could have found a way to survive was by changing their habits, was by taking on new information and making changes. And I really like this idea because that means that all of us are descended from this group of 2,000 humans who lived 70,000 years ago. There was a much larger population of people before that, and clearly there is a much larger population of people after this. But every human being on the planet is genetically connected to this group of 2,000 people. And why is that important? Well, it's because that group of humans was different. They were smarter. They were the 2,000 smartest individuals on the planet at the time. And we are descendants of theirs. That means that human beings after 70,000 years ago are more intelligent than any human beings that lived previous to that, and that their descendants all contain that capacity, that ability to think differently, to be more critically minded, to make changes when things don't seem to be working. And that's why in the last 70,000 years, humanity has progressed in ways that we didn't before then. For most of the time period before that, Homo sapiens, the humans who lived on the planet, lived the same lifestyle generation after generation. After 70,000 years, we end up with farming. We end up with communities being built, small groups of people. And it's not everywhere. It starts in some locations, and maybe those locations contained the smartest people. By 30,000 years ago, we're at the age of the pyramids. By 10,000 years ago, we have the beginnings of a written history and stories being passed down. The intelligence that enabled human beings to write is something we acquired from this group of 2,000 humans. Had this event not happened, we may never have progressed to a level of intelligence beyond the tribes that hunted and gathered. But because of this, we were able to farm, we were able to write, we were able to build communities that could function in a size larger than just a few family groups. And the rest of history is told because of this group of 2,000 humans surviving across the entire globe. And go with me here, because this is amazing. Think about this. The ancestors of these 2,000 people created the empires of the earth. The Chinese dynasties, the Egyptian pharaohs, the empires of Rome, of Great Britain, of America. But there's a dark side to this too. Before this event happened, human beings didn't go to war the way they do now. Family groups may have competed with other family groups. Tribes may have competed with other tribes, but not in the way that we do now. For all the benefits that we've gotten from progress, democracy, human rights, security, well-being, medicine, psychology, science, we've also gained the critical thinking skills that can allow us to destroy ourselves. And I don't know about you, but in my mind, this group of 2,000 humans used their critical thinking skills to survive, to take care of one another, to band together, to create unity, and to grow prosperously. And that is the correct use of this intellect that we all share. It is not to destroy each other. It is not to bring competition and greed for power. And this is my belief, that it is only in growing together and using this intellectual ability for good that we can truly honor these 2,000 people from which we are all descended. Very few of us live in societies anymore where we venerate the dead the way that our ancestors did, or worship them. But many of us live in societies where we respect the dead. We respect our ancestors, our forefathers, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. And many of us feel a very specific pride in being able to provide for our children in ways that our grandparents couldn't, but sacrificed so that we would end up in a better place. And that is the story of parents for generations now. That goes back all the way to this 2,000 humans. So I don't mean to preach, but let me just say that in order to respect the 2,000 people who survived a cataclysm that we have not seen since, then isn't it our responsibility to do the same? Thanks for listening to this episode of Myth. Welcome back, everyone. I told you guys I would take a hiatus about a year ago from this in order to get to a place where I could be doing these podcasts as well as I possibly can in a way that I feel does them justice. So we're back. And thank you for tuning in. I hope you will join me again in the future for more stories and myths and the way that these myths and stories connect to what it means to be human. My name is Tom, and I'm the host of the show. And if you would like to help support this show, then the best thing, the absolute best thing you can possibly do is to tell a friend about it. When you have friends on the internet, on Facebook and social media saying, hey, I need a podcast to listen to, recommend something, please recommend the show. And if you're excited about the first few episodes that I've put out and where this podcast will go, and you're excited about the show coming back, please leave a 5-star rating and review on whatever podcatcher you listen to. Apple Podcasts is the main one still, and it's a great way for you to help me get the word out to people about what this show is about and let them know that they'll like it, or at least why you like it. So if they share your opinion, they might check out the show. It also helps with our ranking on Apple Podcasts and gets us out there for more people when they just search shows that include mythology or human history and those kinds of things. So thank you for all of that. Thank you for all of your help. And if you're interested in being part of our community and talking about issues like this and the other things going on the Robots Radio Network, which includes a whole bunch of podcasts that I do and a bunch of other people do, then check out robotsradio.net. Look up the Robots Radio Discord server where you can chat with me and everyone else and like almost 900 other people at this point about all these different kinds of interesting concepts and stuff like that. Or follow us on Twitter and send me a message at Podcast Myth. All right, friends, thanks for following the show, and I will talk to you again soon. Thanks for listening to Myth. If you'd like to send us a note, we'd love to hear from you at myththepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter @podcastmyth. If you'd like to support the show, please tell a friend or leave a review on iTunes. Or if you'd like to help us out financially and experience an ad-free version of the show, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/myth_podcast. Thanks for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons at patreon.com/myth_podcast.
Robots Radio presents
Myth, the podcast where we explore the very soul of the human story. You and your men gather around the bonfire in a little village on your way home. It's been months since you've been back to Rome. Your soldiers are weary. You've been on the road. Many battles have scarred them in ways both physical and emotional. But as the end of the year approaches and the air gets cooler, you're thankful for a time of rest. The soldiers that you've gathered together are the remnants of a group that set out in the spring, and they're ready to go home. The good people of this village have offered you warmth and food, and as you gather around the bonfire, you share with them what little you have to give back. Stories. And at first the conversation revolves around commonalities, things that you have in common with this group of Romans on the outskirts of the empire. But soon it turns to stranger things. Stories of your adventures, of the places you've been, the things you've seen in faraway lands, and what you've learned on your journeys. The head of the village welcomes you to feast, brings out the food, and says, "Welcome, good countrymen. We appreciate your service to the empire, and we wish you safe travels in the morning as you continue home to Rome. Feast, make yourselves comfortable." And you stand and you give your salutations and your thanks to the people of the village. And you say, "I wish we could give you more, but we thank you for your hospitality. What we can't give you in coin or in services, we can return to you with stories." And so you begin retelling stories of your adventures and the strange lands you've been to. And before long, after a number of rounds of drinks, things start to loosen up. And talk of the gods and of the faiths of the people that you've visited begins to be shared among your men and the people of the village. And this catches the attention of the head of the village, who says, "So tell us more of your journeys, of these strange foreign gods." And you look at your men and you say, "Well, there is one we've heard about, and a number of the men now follow, who, well, we believe grants salvation." And the villagers look interestingly at you, and the village leader says, You're talking about salvation apart from the Roman gods? How does that work?" And you respond, "Well, there is a rite and a ritual, including blood and the forgiveness of sin." And the group looks even more interesting at your group, and you bring over one of your soldiers who is wearing a sign, a symbol of this new deity. And you say, "Well, this is the symbol of the deity, and we will be celebrating in just a few months, on December 25th, the birth of this god. And many of us now follow this god." And the villagers look puzzled. So the birth of a new god, how does that work? And you explain to them that this was a miraculous birth. And some would say that this new deity was delivered from a virgin. And murmurs echo between the villagers. How could this be? What, born of a virgin? How does that work? And discussion follows, and stories get told. And by the end of the night, the question arises from the villagers, "Well, is this your new god? Do you believe that this is the god?" And a number of your soldiers stand together and reply, "Yes, this god has been with us on the road. They have seen us through difficult times, brought us triumph, and is returning with us to Rome." And we will share this with whoever will listen, because we believe that our contract with this God brings forth the salvation of all, friendship, and the success of the empire. The next morning dawns, and your men rise and bid the villagers farewell and thank them one last time for their warmth, the beds, and the food that they shared. And you continue on your way. And this story repeats itself day after day until the soldiers make their way back to Rome. In the ancient world, stories like this may have occurred more regularly than what we would imagine. And the story that I'm telling here is not about Christianity and Jesus, although it has similarities. This is a story about Mithras. Mithras was a Persian god, a god that they worshipped in Iran, the god of contracts and friendship. By the time word of him spread to the Greek and the Roman lands, he was also seen as a god of the sun. And yes, the ancient world was very complex. The Greeks had their own gods, the ones that we now relate to, say, the planets. And the Romans took many of those Greek gods and used them for themselves. But there were many other groups of individuals who worshipped gods of other lands. And stories were told and shared, and many of the stories that we know today were passed down word of mouth from one group of people to another group. And many of these stories had commonalities. In the story of Mithras, he slayed a bull, and the bull is depicted as white. And in the slaying of that bull, he spilt the blood of the bull. And there's a painting on the wall of the St. Prisca Mithraeum, dated all the way back to the 2nd century of the Common Era. And it's in Rome, and it contains the words which are translated, "You have saved us in the shed blood." So scholars have speculated that there is some form of salvation through blood tied to the cult of Mithras. Similarly, there are stories about Mithras that potentially could have him being born of a virgin. And he's not the only one. There are many figures throughout the ancient world who were rumored to be born of a virgin. This was a symbol that these individuals were different, that they were heaven sent, or they were like the gods, and that their teachings or the things they represented needed to be taken as more valuable than those of a common person. Now, there are other stories about Mithras, that he was actually born of a rock, that it came out of the side of a cave. The rock concept is more substantiated, but there are rumors that potentially the virgin birth was also associated with Mithra. And like all of these things, at different times in different places, people believe different things. And people mixed beliefs. There are many symbols and rituals that can be assigned to multiple deities. The symbol that the soldier was wearing was probably a circle with a cross in it, but the cross would have been sideways or diagonal. A symbol with a cross. A cross symbol isn't unique only to Christianity and the Mithras cult. It may have been associated with an ancient Egyptian deity as well, one who was worshipped 2,000 years before the time of Jesus. 2,000 years. That's the same amount of time that has passed from us to the life of Jesus as from Jesus back to this Egyptian god. The story goes that the Egyptian queen Mut-em-Ua, who is said to have been a virgin at the time, gave birth to the pharaoh Amenhotep III. And she had been told that she was with child by the god Tot. And the god Neph impregnated her by holding a cross, the symbol of life, to her mouth. Amenhotep's birth was celebrated by the gods and by 3 kings who offered him gifts. You see the similarities here between the story with Jesus, 3 kings and gifts, the cross, the virgin birth. This was 2,000 years before the time of Christianity. There are other virgin births as well throughout stories, many, many different virgin births. Ra, the Egyptian sun god, was supposedly born of a virgin. Net, Horus, was the son of the virgin mother Isis. In Egypt and in other places such as Assyria, Greece, Cyprus, and Carthage, a mythological virgin mother and her child was often a popular subject of art and sculpture. Attis, a Phrygian Greek vegetation god, was born of the virgin Nana. And by one tradition, Dionysus, the Greek character, half god and half human, was the son of Zeus, born to the virgin Persephone. And Persephone also supposedly birthed Jason, a character with no father, human or divine. And in other Greek myths, Perseus was born to a mortal woman named Danae and fathered by Zeus. And we know that Zeus got around. Zeus also slept with a mortal woman named Io, and they had a son and a daughter. He slept with the mortal Leda, who gave birth, to Helen of Troy and other children. And some stories say that Helen of Troy was actually hatched from an egg. And the stories go on from there. The philosopher Plato in Greece is said by some to have been born of the virgin Perictione and fathered by the god Apollo, who gave warning to Ariston, Perictione's husband-to-be. These stories are all over the ancient world. They are everywhere. And they don't just include mythological characters like Zeus mating with a woman in order to give birth to some half god, half man, demigod of some sort. When we think about these things in our modern world, you impose the name of Zeus on something and it almost becomes a cartoon. But you use the word Jesus and all of a sudden it becomes serious. What about a name like Mithras? We're not as familiar with that in the Western world. So again, it becomes more serious. And then you start talking about real people. Plato. Plato was a real person. We have documents written by Plato. We have many people who wrote about Plato's teachings. We have government documents noting that Plato was a person. What about somebody as famous and as real as Alexander the Great? Well, there's myths about him too. In one story, Zeus, in the form of a snake, impregnated his mother with him. Stories of other real humans also have mythological births. In the days after Buddhism was created and started to take hold in India, followers of Siddhartha Gautama decided he must have been born of a virgin named Maya by divine decree. Genghis Khan, who many of us associate with the conquest and the murder of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, in some stories was born to a virgin seated by a great miraculous light. Also, in that part of the world, the founder of the Chinese Empire, Fo He, is said to be born of a woman, not necessarily a virgin, when she ate a flower or a red fruit. It's also said that in Korea, the river Ho gave birth to a son when seated by the sun itself. These stories range the spectrum of the ancient world. They're not just things that come up in Mediterranean tales or the Middle East. We can go as far away as Korea and find stories of virgin birth. If we come back to Rome, then there are also stories about Augustus Caesar, who was supposedly born when Apollo slept with a mortal woman named Attia. Later on, he was called a savior and the Son of God, and his birthday was celebrated. A birthday that marked for the world the beginning of good tidings through his coming. And this was something that some Romans would claim about him. The idea that you worshipped the emperor was built into these cults or religions, depending on your view of it, in a way that turned these powerful individuals into more than just human. Even the founding of Rome is built around myth. It's said that Rome was founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus. And Romulus, in some stories, was born of the virgin Rhea Silvia. These stories are not unique. This is something that happens across most of the world and has been happening. And by has been happening, I mean these stories have been being told, not necessarily that these virgin births have occurred, but the stories of virgin births have been shared and continue to be shared by people across the world and have been for at least 4,000 years. Is there something innately human about this? Is there something in us that seeks for gods to walk among us, to have certainty in somebody who is more than we know we are, because we see the faults, we see the limitations in our own flesh? Or maybe, and some people would consider this another possibility, that all of these myths point to some deeper truth, that they are all reflections of a true story. To many Christians, this would be background and support for the idea that the world was preparing for an actual virgin birth, and that occurred with Jesus of Nazareth. That talk of salvation among other faiths was preparation for salvation through Jesus. But couldn't you make that argument for any single one of these different faiths, that the others were in preparation or echoes of your one true faith? Where does it start? Where does it end? Is there a singular truth? Or are all of these stories that simply reflect the nature of what it means to be human? Somebody like Sigmund Freud, for all of his faults and all of the beliefs and psychology that we now know don't really hold up, did create a foundation for thought around psychological events with humans. And somebody like Sigmund Freud would say that these are all reflections of deeper seated needs within ourselves. That when we think about a mother deity, that is us yearning for our natural mothers. That when we seek a faith that provides salvation, that is fulfilling a basic need for safety. When we associate ourselves with a god or a faith that says that we were chosen, that we are children of that God, that gives us a justification for having a place in society, and that all of these different faiths put us at the center of the universe. Whether it's the ancient cult of Mithras, or Christianity, or even belief that your emperor came into being through a virgin birth, these are all stories that ultimately point back to us. They're all about us. They're all about our need to feel like we have a place in this world. They're all about our own justification of existing. And they all give us a center place in the universe. There's something fundamental about needing this. Why is it that human beings don't seem to be okay with the idea that we are a speck on creation, that we are a limited, very short-lived creature in the span of it all? In the full expanse of the universe, in the 13.7 billion years since the Big Bang, or whatever you want to believe created everything, our lifespans rarely go for more than 100 years. We are but a speck. We are living on a tiny little planet circling a very average star in one of the arms of a galaxy that may be one of hundreds of billions, if not more. And when you look at the world this way, it certainly seems like we aren't very important. Think about the world today. How many humans are on the planet? 7 billion humans. And then there's just you and me. Where do we fit in among 7 billion people? Are any of us truly unique? Or is there someone else out there that is pretty much just like us? All of us have this basic need to try to justify ourselves in the universe, to tie ourselves to something greater through the worship of something, through a connection to an empire, a nation, our communities. But what if it was true? Or maybe I should say it this way. What if we could live the truth that we ourselves are unique? That simply within each of us is something that has never existed before. And simply because of this, not because of anything outside of ourselves, simply because of who we are and what we are capable of, we have value. Simply because of that there's nothing that we need outside of ourselves to give us permission. What if inside of each of us is that? Think about it. We were created in some way, and many different people have many different beliefs about how that works. But simply the fact that we were created means that the universe or God deemed us creatable, deemed us worthy to be created. We were given permission on our birth to be something special. And in that way, aren't we all the sons and the daughters of creation itself? Does it matter if we directly came from a virgin birth, or if the person that we look up to or worship came from a virgin birth? Weren't we all created ultimately by the universe itself? Is that good enough? Hey friends, this is your host, Tom. Thanks again for tuning into this episode of Myth. I hope you guys are enjoying the new episodes, and I'm planning to continue doing these. And I'd love to hear some feedback from you. I'd love to hear what you like about these episodes, what you're enjoying about the show, and any feedback at all would be awesome. You can send me a message on Twitter at Podcast Myth, or you can send me an email at myththepodcast@gmail.com, or you can check out all the different shows at robotsradio.net. That's the network that I have of a bunch of different podcasts. But please reach out to me. Let me know what you think about the show. And I could definitely use your help with making sure that I can keep producing these episodes. This is something that I've been endeavoring to do, this show, along with all of the other shows that I do in the network, as a full-time job for myself. I currently work part-time at my regular job. I've been able, through the other podcasts that I've been doing longer, to shift my schedule to part-time and to do podcasting part-time. But I'm looking to do this full-time, and I would love to keep making content and getting more and more better content, I guess you could say, out there for everybody. So if this is something you'd like to support, then please share this show with your friends. Let them know, hey, I found a really cool podcast to listen to. Here you go. Send them the link. Get them listening. If you are on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a rating and review, and that is extremely helpful. Podcasts with more ratings and more listens are more likely to show up in recommendations on Apple Podcasts and other podcatchers as well. So if you're listening on a different platform and you can leave a rating and a review for the show, please do that as well. And if you'd like to support the show financially, which would be absolutely amazing, you can check out the rewards you can get for supporting our show on Patreon at patreon.com/myth_podcast. There are links to all of these things in the show notes. And really, any support you can give me to help me keep going with this would be extremely, extremely appreciated. So thank you so much for tuning into the show. And until next week, remember that you're somebody, and that's good enough. All right. Talk to you later. Thanks for listening to Myth. If you'd like to send us a note, we'd love to hear from you at myththepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter at podcastmyth. If you'd like to support the show, please tell a friend or leave a review on iTunes. Or if you'd like to help us out financially and experience an ad-free version of the show, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/myth_podcast. Thanks for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons at patreon.com/myth_podcast.
Robots Radio presents
Myth, the podcast where we explore the very soul of the human story. You've heard the rumors about the forest people, that they're not human. They eat children, and they have weird, strange ceremonies, and they worship evil gods. But these were all myths. These were all stories. These were the things that the old people talked about in the village, and you never believed them for real. I mean, sure, there were times that you and your friends went out into the forest and strange things happened. You couldn't explain it. It wasn't an animal, but you weren't sure what it was. And it moved out of sight too quickly to know. You've also come across strange crafted tools and odd objects and even footprints that look like people, but you know that your villagers weren't in the area. But they're stories, right? Well, that's what you thought. Until one day, the forest people emerged from the forest on their own. A small group of them carefully walked toward the village, and everyone stopped. Everybody you know immediately put down their things and stared. There were only 4. The one in front was a little bigger than the others, and they looked kind of like your people, but they were shorter and broader, maybe more animalish. The one in front brought what appeared to be trinkets, small items. They looked like they had been crafted by children. You couldn't quite make out what they were from a distance, but they placed them on the ground, and with some gesturing and some sounds that you didn't understand, kneeled before you, and the others kneeled as well. What was the sign? What were these people doing, if they were even people? The village elders gathered together and approached. It looked like they didn't mean you any harm. The rumors said that they ate children, that they abducted people into their society, or whatever you would want to call it. But these seemed peaceful. They seemed like they wanted to trade. So the village elders approached, and after some communication, I guess you could say, some pointing and grunting, it seemed as if they were pointing towards the fire and toward the meat, the deer that was cooking on the fire. They were hungry, and they wanted to trade. So in good faith, the elders gave them an offering and took their trinkets, and they were on their way. And it's been a few weeks since this occurred, and you haven't seen them. But as you think back on the event, it makes sense. It has been a very hard winter. It seems like in the last few years, the world is getting colder. And the forest people might be having a hard time finding the food that they need. Your own people have had to travel further and have had to hunt more in order to find the food that they need. So food is definitely in low supply. So it was another cold morning a few weeks after this event, and you and your hunting party have set out into the forest looking for prey. And this time you took a different direction. You headed a little bit more up into the hills, further than where you normally went. And before long, you saw the remnants of a village. You came across a place that you had never been before. And as you wandered in, you could see that there were simple huts outside of a cave. What looked like the remnants of fire. The writing of icons, pictures on the sides of the walls, and on the leather left from the animals that made the tents outside of this cave. There were what appeared to be simple weapons and tools around a fire pit, and you have to admit that curiosity got to you. You decided to venture into the cave. You waved to your group to move on in with you, and as you approached the front of this cave, you realized that the smell was extreme. You hadn't smelled something like this ever, and it wasn't excrement, it wasn't waste. It was remains. And at first, in the front of the cave, you saw the remains that were familiar to you. Animals, deer, other creatures from the forest. But as you got deeper into the cave, you realized that there were fresher remains in the back. Bodies looked like they had been dragged into the back of the cave, but not buried. And among those bodies were two younger forest people, the only two who looked like they were left. And you never quite figured out what happened on that day. The two young forest people, a child and maybe a teenager, were famished. And the bodies on the ground looked like they hadn't eaten in weeks. They hadn't been dead too long, and most of them were covered with furs, just like the two surviving children. You felt bad for them. And they were very cautious of you at first. They backed further into the cave. They wouldn't even come close. So you signaled to the rest of the group to stand back. And you took from a member of your party a rabbit, a hare that you had caught in your hunting, and you held it out to them. And their eyes became very wide. You could tell that they were very hungry. And slowly, they moved forward. And you gave them the hare. And they looked at you with an expression that you can only relate to confusion or fear. And you reached around their shoulders and you brought them into you, and the younger one gave you a hug. It was that day that you brought these two survivors back to your village. It had been the hardest winter that you recall. So hard that a small village of these forest people didn't survive it. And it was on that day that your village grew by 2. You quickly learned that once these two were fed again, that they worked hard. They chipped in. The younger one started to pick up the language and was able to communicate, remembered simple phrases and the names of things. And the older one, too, in time, learned to communicate. And they were short, but they were strong. They had stern faces, but they were resolute. Sure, they didn't understand some of the basic concepts of what it meant to be one of your people. The fundamental things that everyone grew up knowing were foreign to them, but you could tell that there was no desire for them to eat your children or your babies. These were two people. They just looked different. And over time, they grew to become solid members of the village. They even settled down and married into the group. Their children are a joy to behold. They look a little different than most of the children in the village, but they are no less loving and playful. You never really did find out who these people were or where they came from. And to be honest, it really didn't seem to matter. After years of living together, they were part of your group, and you think back on that day when 4 of them came to visit, asking for food, and you wonder if you couldn't have done more. If it wasn't for the fear of the unknown, the rumors, the old stories, was there something that could have been done? Could you have lived in peace and helped these people? Could you have worked together? Were they as different from you as you originally thought? So a lot of people don't really understand the human genome, Homo sapiens, where we came from, how we are connected to other humans along the family tree of life. And another thing that they don't really understand is that that tree isn't a single branch, that it is a number of branches that break off and then come back together. Homo sapiens, us, are the branch that survived. And it might be because of our brains. In the last episode, I talked about how it was our ability to reason that helped us survive in a time when our population was reduced to maybe 2,000 people. It was our ability to make critical decisions, and that may have been what kept us going. But we haven't always been alone on this planet as the only, quote, people, the only persons. And you might think, okay, there were the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals is actually the way to pronounce it as far as I've learned. And they were very human-like, and common thought is that they were cavemanish, that they were dumb, that they were very unrefined and not like ourselves. But more and more recent evidence points to this idea that they were a culture, that they practiced art. And if they practiced art, then they probably worshipped some form of gods. They had deities, they had traditions, they had abstract thought, which means that they probably weren't that different than we are. But they're not the only other humans who have been on this planet. So let's go back about 30,000 years. This is after that crash that I mentioned in the last episode. That, well, maybe not crash, that bottleneck. That's the better word for it. 30,000 years ago. From what we know of the science right now, we were one of most likely 4 different types of human subspecies on the planet, and a number of Homo sapiens in different locations around the world coexisted with at least one of these other lines of humans. There are the Homo sapiens, that's us, and then there's the Neanderthals, and then there's the Denisovans, who were much like the Neanderthals, but are kind of a slightly different line. They are genetically a little bit different, whereas the Neanderthals were more likely to have existed and lived in places like Europe and Western Asia. The Denisovans most likely dwelled in Central, Eastern, and Southern Asia. Both of these species had complex thought, they had art, they had broader shoulders, they had thicker bones, they probably were stocky, and their faces were flatter with very large brow ridges, things like that. They appeared more hardy than a typical Homo sapien. And then there's the Homo Floresiensis. These are an archaic human who inhabited at least one island in Indonesia. Chances are we had very limited interaction with them, but there is some speculation about that. Now, what's interesting about these 4 different groups, well, there's a few things that are interesting. First, if there can be a subspecies of human that exists on a single island in Indonesia, then there could be other species of subhumans in other locations that we haven't discovered yet. Secondly, there's evidence in our DNA. According to the latest data, the proportion of Neanderthal inherited genetic material is around 1.5 to 2.1% and is found in all non-African populations. This suggests that 20% of Neanderthal DNA survives in modern humans. Much of it is expressed in hair, skin, and diseases transmitted among human populations. This is very interesting. There is proof that Neanderthals had among them members of their society that were blue-eyed and light-haired, and that maybe some of these genes exist in modern European descent individuals. So that means that there was interbreeding, that these branches broke apart and then came back together. There is similar evidence that among Asian populations, Denisovan DNA exists. So we have different times, different places in our human history where we not only coexisted with humans of different types, we came across them in the wild, we came across them in nature. Our genome broke apart, our people groups separated for long enough periods of time for us to evolve in very different directions, and then came back together. And that's probably an overly simplistic picture of what actually happened, but the DNA evidence shows that at least that happened. So the story I posed to you at the beginning of this episode brings about a potential situation that may have occurred where people come across other people who look different, who act different, and yet are not that different. So they take into their tribe two of these individuals who are left, who have need. And those people become part of their tribe because they're not that different. Now, we know humanity wasn't as peaceful as the situation I pose in the story at the beginning, that in many situations there may have been wars, battles, conflicts between different groups of people. And in those kinds of situations, we know that humans, at least from what we know about ourselves, are not necessarily the best actors in those situations. That things like slavery, rape, things like that occur in situations like that. And that's another way that genes can be passed from one group to another. And although we don't have a specific picture of what may have happened during this time in our past, again, this is way before writing, way before the passing of knowledge on paper or on tablet from one generation to the next. But we can assume certain things happened because this time period was very long. As far as maybe 100 or 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens may have been coexisting with other humans on this planet. Up until maybe 30,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago in some locations, potentially. But like I mentioned on the previous episode, this might have deeper ramifications. This might have an effect on the stories that we tell. How many myths include humanoid creatures? And I've thought about this before. Let's take a centaur, for example. A story of a half horse, half human. How does that come about? Is it because we get creative when we go, oh, let's see what happens if we put a horse and a person together? We know what a horse is and we know what a person is. Let's stick them together. Let's turn it into another creature. And now all of a sudden we have a story to tell the children. Is it that? Does it have to do with personifying nature? That's another thing that we do psychologically. We like to personify things. We see faces in the clouds. We draw faces on a rock and all of a sudden we have a friend. Or is it deeper seated? If you look at the myths throughout human history, it's not uncommon for us to have stories of humanoids who are different from ourselves. And by the time you get to Egyptian mythology, you have gods who have the head of a bird or the head of a snake or a crocodile, for example. Or you go to India and Hindu mythology has a god like Ganesha, who is elephant headed. Or you head to Greece and you have centaurs, and you have even something like Medusa, a snake-like woman with snakes for her hair. But are these simplified, more recent versions of older stories that talk about people who are people that are different than we are? It may be hard-coded, and maybe hard-coded isn't the right way to say it. It may be foundationally placed in the psyche of our humanity, in the stories and the foundations of our stories, to tell tales of people that are different than we are, because for the vast majority of our existence on the planet as Homo sapiens, passing down oral stories, we have time and time again come into contact with people on this planet who are different than we are. Can you imagine what that would have been like? Was it scary? Did they tell stories of the people in the forest? Was there open knowledge of the different groups? Did they mark the territory that they each had and stayed away from each other? Maybe all of these situations happened at some point. But if these situations were happening for tens of thousands of years, then by the time you get to 5,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, doesn't it make sense that that foundation, that idea, is inherent in just our storytelling? That we believe we live in a world where there are different types of people? That something like a minotaur isn't too far-fetched? And would these other types of people have appeared more animalistic to Homo sapiens? Would they have appeared to be more bestial and different from themselves? Or would we have accepted them as just a different kind of tribe, just a different kind of people who live over on the other side of the river? What would you do if you were back 30,000 years ago, and when you were wandering through the forest, you came across a human, but a different kind of human? This has been another episode of Myth. Thank you for tuning in. This is your host, Tom, and I have a new review to read out to you guys. This came through Apple Podcasts, and it's from Calross S12 in the United States, who writes, "A diamond in the rough, 5 stars, 10 out of 10. Myth is a podcast that's quality, hits the ground running, and doesn't slow down. The way the episodes are presented are very enjoyable, and Robots, that's the name I go by on the internet, is an amazing host. I highly recommend the episode The Darkest Day, as it is one of the best podcast episodes I have ever heard. In the pile of many podcasts about human history, this one shines bright." Well, thank you, Calross. That is a glowing review, and I really, really appreciate it. And if you would like to help me to grow this show, then there are a few things you can do. Of course, you can leave a rating or review on whatever podcatcher you use. Apple Podcasts is great because it's something people use to search for new shows, and a lot of people listen on Apple Podcasts. And I will also read those out on future episodes of the show. Another thing that you can do is to tell your friends. In fact, that's probably the biggest thing you can possibly do to help me to grow this show. And it really comes down to you guys. I can only create content and try to put out the best content I possibly can. It comes down to your ability to help me spread that content around. I don't advertise the show. I don't pay for ads to run on Google or anything like that. I'm not putting billboards up in major cities. So if you can help me out by telling your friends that you enjoy the show, that they would enjoy it as well, then that is absolutely the best thing that you can do to help me keep the show growing so that I can keep creating great content. Also, if you are interested in helping me directly financially, you can go to patreon.com/myth_podcast. There's another one. There's one that was taken by somebody, just Myth Podcast. It's not it. And that one's not active. myth_podcast. And you can sign up at multiple different levels of tiers and look at all the different rewards you can get for helping me out. If you have any questions or thoughts or anything else you would like to send me, I would love to hear from you. So follow me on Twitter at podcastmyth, or email me at myththepodcast@gmail.com, or you can click the show note link for our Discord. We have a Discord server with a bunch of people who pop in and talk about all sorts of different things. So you can always reach out to me on there as well. There's all sorts of fun places you can go and ways that you can interact with me and the community around the Robots Radio Network. So go check that stuff out. All the links are in the show notes. And until next week, stay safe out there. I'll talk to you later. Thanks for listening to Myth. If you'd like to send us a note, we'd love to hear from you at myththepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter at podcastmyth. If you'd like to support the show, please tell a friend or leave a review on iTunes. Or if you'd like to help us out financially and experience an ad-free version of the show, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/myth_podcast. Thanks for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon.